Administrator of the U.S. Department of Energy Information Administration. He has worked extensively on electricity policy issues and economy-wide energy modeling for 25 years. He is a friend of this committee's, a source of information on an ongoing basis. We welcome you back, Doctor. If you could move that microphone in, and we would appreciate it. And whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Energy Information Administration's analysis of the Renewable Electricity Standard, or RES, program in Title I.
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? Because it's like being in Yankee Stadium.
Is that right? You want me to speak up?
No. It's like being in Yankee Stadium and all of a sudden, you know, in walks Lou Gehrig or in walks Mickey Mantle and in walks Bobby Garcia, the former great congressman from the state of New York. So it's so great to see. When
I grew up in New York also.
Yeah, well, yeah. So it's like being in Cooperstown, you know. So when one of the all-time greats walks in, so we'll start all over again, Dr. Grunsbeck. Okay.
All right. Well, I'm Mr. Chairman. Thank you again. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Energy Information Administration's analysis of the Renewable Electricity Standard, or RES, program in Title I of the American Clean Energy and Security Act discussion draft. EIA is the independent statistical and analytical agency within the Department of Energy that produces objective, timely, and relevant data projections and analyses to assist policymakers, help markets function efficiently, and inform the public. We do not promote, formulate, or take positions on policy issues, and our views should not be construed as representing those of the Department of Energy or the administration. Since I appeared before the committee 2 months ago, EIA has updated its annual Energy Outlook reference case to reflect enactment of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA, which provides significant new federal funding, loan guarantees, and tax credits to stimulate investments in renewable energy. The potential impact of the ARRA provisions on the projected use of renewable generation is large enough that an analysis of the RES that did not include ARRA in the reference case could provide misleading results, and we do include it in this analysis here that I will discuss. The RES proposal sets a target of 25% of covered sales of electricity in 2025 and beyond be provided by eligible renewable energy. However, because of exemptions provided to small sellers and to sales of electricity from certain generation sources, and the possibility that credits for qualified state energy efficiency programs could be used to meet a portion of the RES requirement, the amount of eligible renewables as a share of total electricity sales required to comply with the RES would be lower than the nominal target. EIA modeled 2 RES policy cases for this analysis. One case assumes that the maximum level of efficiency credits, up to 1/5 of the RES target in any given year, are claimed, while the other case that assumes that states cannot qualify for or elect not to use efficiency credits. Turning now to some of the main results from our analysis, power sellers will turn to a mix of renewable fuels to comply with the RES. In absolute terms, the key fuels are projected to be biomass and wind, but other renewable fuels, including solar and geothermal, are also projected to grow significantly in percentage terms. The higher renewable generation stimulated by the RES leads to lower coal and natural gas generation. The increased use of renewables stimulated by the RES also leads to lower electricity sector carbon dioxide emissions. Electricity sector carbon dioxide emissions in 2030 are between 7% and 12% below the reference case level in the 2 RES cases. Given the amount of eligible renewable generation projected in the reference case, the RES is not expected to affect national average electricity prices until 2020. As the required RES share increases to its maximum value in 2025, the value of the RES credits increases and the impacts on national average electricity prices become evident. The projected peak effect on national average electricity prices is between 2.7% and 2.9% in our 2 RES cases. Because of regional difference in electricity market structure, state RES requirements, and the different availability of resources in different areas, price impacts may vary by region as shown in my written testimony. The quantitative results I've just discussed reflect the modeling analysis of the RES provisions on a standalone basis. We recognize that the RES could have significant interactions with other programs in the Chairman's discussion draft. For example, in previous analyses, EIA has generally found that a cap-and-trade program for greenhouse gases leads to significant growth in the use of renewable energy for electricity generation, which becomes more attractive when the cost of using fossil fuels goes up. To the extent that the proposed cap-and-trade program induces more renewable resources than required by a concurrent RES proposal, one might expect RES compliance costs to be reflected in the value of carbon dioxide allowances. Therefore, adding our standalone estimates of the costs of an RES to a standalone estimate of a cap-and-trade program cost would overstate the projected combined costs of implementing the two programs concurrently. In contrast, an energy efficiency resource standard, which can reduce or eliminate projected growth in electricity load and therefore the need for additional generation capacity, makes it more likely that a given RES target will require that generation from new eligible renewable capacity replace generation from existing capacity rather than from other types of new capacity. The cost penalty associated with backing out existing capacity, whose capital cost is already sunk, is typically much larger than the cost penalty associated with backing out alternative types of new capacity. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, this concludes my testimony. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Grunsbeck, very much. Our next witness is Dan Riker. He is Director of Climate Change and Energy Initiatives at Google. He was previously co-founder of the New Energy Capital Corporation and served as Assistant Attorney General for Environmental Protection of Massachusetts. So we thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. First, I want to applaud the subcommittee's work on this path-breaking and comprehensive bill. I'll make 3 points in my opening statement related to the Renewable Energy Standard, energy project finance, and energy information. First, Mr. Chairman, the Renewable Energy Standard in the bill is technically and economically achievable. Our nation has more than adequate renewable energy resources to meet the RES, and with continued technological advances and policy support, they become more cost-effective every day. And by implementing the RES in conjunction with the Energy Efficiency Resource Standard, we can dramatically cut the need to add additional generation. In my testimony, I highlight what may be the sleeping giant of renewable energy. Enhanced geothermal systems, or EGS, uses a common technique in the oil industry to fracture hot rock deep below the Earth's surface. Water is injected into the rock where it is heated to produce steam, then piped to the surface to generate electricity. A 2007 MIT study found that just 2% of the heat below the continental U.S. between 3 and 10 kilometers is equivalent to over 2,500 times total U.S. annual energy use. At Google, we've mapped the EGS resource state by state, and I'd like to submit the 50-state map for the record, Mr. Chairman. Our calculations show that just 2% of the EGS generation potential in South Carolina is almost 2/3 of current generating capacity. In Texas, it is double. In Arkansas, it is triple. In Maine, it is quadruple. In Oregon, it is 9 times. In Idaho, 32 times existing capacity. And, Mr. Chairman, only half jokingly, if the big dig in Boston had been vertical instead of horizontal, we might be powering a good chunk of Massachusetts using EGS. The beauty of EGS is that it provides baseload generation 24 hours a day. The U.S. once led in EGS technology, but leadership is now in Australia, where commercial projects are under construction, and Europe, where demonstration projects are at the megawatt scale are already operating. We have a chance to catch up thanks to $400 million for geothermal in the stimulus legislation. In addition to adopting an RES, the House should look at providing a credit multiplier for baseload technologies like EGS. The House should also authorize and appropriate significant federal support for EGS R&D beyond the stimulus. I'd also suggest, Mr. Chairman, an oversight hearing on this potentially transformational technology. Turning to my second point, the legislation we're considering does not directly address a critical issue in advancing our clean energy economy, increasing access to capital for the deployment of literally trillions of dollars worth of clean energy projects that will be essential to meeting our climate and energy goals, including an RES and EERS. Last week, Senators Bingaman and Murkowski jointly released a discussion draft of a bill that would create the 21st Century Energy Technology Deployment Administration, or CETA. I know Congressman Inslee has also been advancing this concept, and Congress Van Hollen introduced a separate proposal. The mission of CETA would be to encourage wide-scale deployment of clean energy technologies, particularly those that are perceived as too risky by commercial lenders, but with high potential to address our environmental, economic, and security challenges. Moving a technology from small pilot project to full commercial scale plant is often the point at which many promising energy technologies die. We call it the valley of death. I urge the committee to consider incorporating the CETA approach into the legislation we are considering today in order to address this critical problem. My third and final point involves improving access to energy information. With a national RES and EERS, Congress should also ensure that electricity consumers, large and small, have a more accurate picture of their electricity usage as well as the source and mix of their power. Congress should work to ensure that utilities provide consumer access to energy information through smart meters and other devices in as near real time as possible. President Obama has talked about how the smart grid funding in the stimulus bill could support the installation of as many as 40 million smart meters. However, draft guidance issued by the DOE on the smart grid program may discourage large-scale smart meter deployments. Congress should push DOE to support large investments in smart meter deployments and ensure consumer access to data. Finally, I'd like to urge the subcommittee to work with the new administration to determine how the Energy Information Administration could play a much more vital role in providing consumers and businesses with critical energy information. For example, with a national RES and EERS, the federal government will need to collect data at an unprecedented level in order to ensure compliance. Congress should ensure that EIA has timely access to critical data to gauge progress on key clean energy programs. This will require an extension of EIA's role and an increase in its funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Riker, very much. Our next witness, Diane Grunick, has been Commissioner of the California Public Utilities Commission since 2005. She is a nationally recognized expert in energy and environmental issues. And to be honest with you, the reason that I've asked her to come here today is that she's the only witness I've ever heard who knows how to make energy efficiency sound exciting. And so since I've heard her do it before, I thought I would give her another chance. So welcome back.
Well, thank you so much. I would love to be talking on energy efficiency. I've slipped it in a little bit, but I'm actually here today on transmission, renewables, and smart grid.
Transmission needs even more work to be to sound
I'll start
exciting.
with my first promo.
Okay, please.
We're building transmission in California. We're building it to meet renewables. If California, with all of our environmental rules and all of our environmental activists can do it, everywhere in the country can do it. This is the Tehachapi Wind Project. It's under development, and when finished, it's going to bring 4,500 megawatts of wind into the transmission grid. So there we go, if that's exciting. But getting back, let me first of all thank you for having me today. I am speaking on my own behalf, but I also bring greetings from Mike Peavy, who is president of our commission. He has reviewed my testimony and wanted to make sure that I passed on that he personally feels very strongly about these remarks as well and agrees with them. Let's start with renewable energy. As Dan Riker just said, there really is no question that the United States is blessed with renewables. This is not a question that we don't have the resources. It's not a question that we don't have the technical capability. It's a question of political will to make it happen. That's the very good news. As of January of this year, 33 states had RPSs or renewable goals. 33 states. At the state level, what we are waiting for is the national renewable standard. It will make a dramatic difference in our ability if we can have, as a nation, all the states, all the utilities moving ahead. In California, we have a 20% renewable standard, but our governor has now signed an executive order to have our state get to 33% renewables by 2020, and our legislature is now considering the bills to codify it. If California can set our goals at 33%, again, the rest of the country really can get to the levels that we're talking about in this bill. There's some really smart, flexible items in the bill on renewables. One of the items that Dan talked about was the part that you can meet your renewable provision through energy efficiency. In a pure world, you probably wouldn't do that. You'd probably just say, go with renewables. But this is a bill, in my mind, that's really trying to make this workable. Every state can do energy efficiency. We need to make sure that that provision is sensible, that it's not just a loophole, but it lets the states that may be farther removed from renewables really come in and go after the renewable section. Another part that I think is very creative that we frankly hadn't thought of in California, but I've now talked with our legislators and suggested they think about it, is the provision that says that you can have a credit of 3 times the renewables if you do local distributed generation. That's a really smart thing to put in the bill, because what it does is that when you're building renewables out to the areas like the Tehachapi's, believe me, it takes years to plan and permit and finance and build those transmission lines. But when you can instead look to do renewables right in your neighborhood, I mean, you can put solar photovoltaics on the rooftops of Costco's and Walmart's. You can have people in the neighborhood start to say, we'll even make it in our own homes on our roofs. And when you give it a 3 times credit, in my mind, we can have some states who have never even had renewables before start to become the leaders. And I hate to say put California and Texas to shame, but that's what we may start happening by some of these very creative provisions in the bill. Let me turn to transmission planning quickly. The interesting thing about the bill is the most important provisions on transmission planning are not in the transmission planning section. These are the provisions that make it a sensible way to do transmission planning. They're the energy efficiency provision, they're the renewable electric portfolio standard, they're the enhancement of the smart grid, they're the focus on distributed generation. All of those are the factors that let you reduce the need for transmission, because we don't build transmission just to have transmission lines. We build transmission because it carries electricity. And by having in this bill the fundamental building blocks that make you look at an entire system that will minimize how much transmission you need, you've got it right. This is, in many ways, the best way that I've seen looking at electricity in 30 years, because you've put in place those building blocks that say when you're doing transmission planning, you're actually doing it in the context of a very sensible approach. The other thing that I'll say about transmission is that it directs FERC to take into account all of these demand-side aspects when they have an expanded role in transmission planning. That is absolutely critical. If Congress is going to give FERC or any other agency at the federal level a larger role in transmission, and particularly in transmission planning, it's essential to have in there the provisions that they must look at the demand side. In fact, I think that the bill should go further and direct FERC in all of its decisions with regard to transmission, including approving transmission investment, that it does not discriminate against the demand side or against distributed generation. Let me just end with the smart grid, that I think that, again, it's got it right. The one part that I would add would be to have some provisions that provide increased technical assistance to the states. Smart grid is going to happen because there are thousands of decisions that government and the private sector is going to make. What you heard from Dan about increasing the information available, that's critical, but we're all going to need much better technical assistance, and that would help. The very last thing that I'll say is to thank you very much for letting me testify today.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. Our next witness is James Robo. He is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Florida Power and Light, or FPL Group. Mr. Robo previously served as Vice President at that company. We thank you so much for testifying today.
Thank you, Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Upton, and members of the committee. I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer of FPL Group, North America's largest producer of renewable energy, and it's my pleasure to be here today to talk about the importance of enacting a renewable electricity standard this year. FPL Group is the nation's #1 producer of electricity from the wind and from the sun. Our wind fleet can power approximately 1.5 million homes and makes up 1/4 of the entire U.S. wind energy market. Our solar power plants in California's Mojave Desert are the largest in the world. In Florida, we're building 110 megawatts of solar power, enough to vault the state into second place in the nation in solar production in the span of only 18 months. And just this week, FPL announced Energy Smart Miami, one of the country's largest implementations of smart grid technology to improve energy efficiency and reduce carbon emissions. We're proud that FPL Group has one of the lowest CO2 emissions rates of any electric power company in the nation. In fact, if every utility were as clean as FPL Group, CO2 emissions from the power sector would be reduced by nearly 50%. Total U.S. carbon emissions would be reduced by 20%, which is the equivalent of removing 209 million cars from the road, or roughly 80% of the nation's vehicles. Renewable energy holds tremendous potential for the United States. Each year, enough solar energy strikes a 90 by 90 mile patch of the Mojave Desert to meet the annual electricity needs of the entire country, and enough wind power sweeps across the Dakotas to meet more than half our electricity needs. We've barely begun to tap this nearly unlimited resource. To do so, it's vital that Congress enact a renewable electricity standard this year, and here's why. First, an RES will help create a clean energy economy. Many countries are betting that the world of the future will thirst for low-carbon energy in the way it thirsts for oil today. We can't afford to remain on the sidelines while the renewables industry and jobs that go along with it are created elsewhere. We're already falling behind even Europe in this regard. In fact, nearly every one of FPL Group's largest renewable energy competitors is from outside the United States. Second, an RES will give the renewable energy industry certainty and will give utility decision makers a sense of urgency. In the electric power sector, we make capital decisions with a 30-year time horizon. We can't spend billions of dollars to build a clean energy economy without confidence that demand for low-carbon power will remain strong. A federal RES with timelines extending to 2039 will send the clearest possible signal to investors that demand for renewables will continue. And the targets that utilities must meet along the way will provide the urgency needed for prompt action. The best incentive to ensure timely and proactive utility decision-making around renewables is a reasonable yet firm target. Third, a federal RES will drive down the cost of renewables. Make no mistake, in many markets today, renewables such as wind are competitively priced, despite the fact that they're disadvantaged versus fossil fuels due to the lack of a price on carbon. The cost of wind power has fallen by roughly 25% over the past decade, even as the average electric bill in the U.S. has risen by nearly 50%. By stimulating demand, an RES will continue to drive down the cost of renewables over time. Fourth, a federal RES will ensure that only the most cost-efficient renewables get built. The current patchwork of more than 30 different state regimes is cumbersome, costly, and creates incentives for bad decisions. For example, many states require utilities to buy only in-state renewable energy, even if it costs more than renewable energy purchased from elsewhere. That's like forcing grocery stores in Maine to buy oranges grown only in Maine. It makes no economic sense. And finally, an RES is essential to address the threat of climate change. That threat isn't just environmental, it's economic. Those who say the cost of addressing climate change is too high assume that doing nothing is free. On the contrary, unchecked climate change could cost the United States tens of billions of dollars over the next 2 decades. But no matter what your beliefs are about climate change, investing in renewable energy makes sense for America. It will replace finite fossil fuels with the infinite energy of the wind and the sun. It will result in cleaner air. It will conserve precious water. It will strengthen our energy security in a volatile world. And finally, it will keep us competitive in the race to build a clean energy economy. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify this afternoon.
Thank you, sir, very much. Our next witness is Gregory Kunkel. He is the Vice President of Environmental Affairs at Tenaska. Mr. Kunkel directs environmental compliance, permitting, and water resources issues at that company. We welcome you, sir.
Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Upton, and happy birthday, by the way. And members of the subcommittee, for this opportunity to discuss Tenaska's 2 commercial-scale electric generation projects using carbon capture and storage technologies, Trailblazer in Texas and Taylorville in Illinois. My name is Dr. Greg Kunkel, and I'm Vice President of Environmental Affairs of Omaha-based Tenaska, one of the largest independent power producers in the United States. Tenaska currently employs nearly 700 people and has developed approximately 9,000 megawatts of natural gas-fired electric generating capacity across the United States. Our affiliates market natural gas, electric power, and biofuels, and also are involved in private equity fund and acquisition management focused on the energy space, including renewable energy, infrastructure development, natural gas pipelines and storage, and electric transmission. The Natural Resource Defense Council benchmarks Tenaska's power plants as having the lowest carbon footprint of any of our peers, less than half the national average emission rate of greenhouse gases. However, as clean as our fleet is, like a number of our peers in the independent power sector, our older long-term contracts did not explicitly anticipate the cost of carbon control. To ensure that these clean, efficient facilities can keep operating, we urge the committee to provide a mechanism for hold these contracted facilities harmless for the duration of their contracts. Now, with regard to carbon capture and storage, Tenaska's current initiatives, Trailblazer and Taylorville, may give the subcommittee some sense of the CCS projects that we believe can be built with today's proven technologies. When Tenaska embarked on developing these utility-scale CCS projects, natural gas prices were high and volatile, and there was a glut of gas generation. This encouraged us to consider coal for baseload power facilities. However, we recognized that new federal, regional, and state greenhouse gas emission controls were very likely during these plants' 50-year life. Of course, just last week, EPA issued its endangerment finding and is considering comprehensive rulemaking to regulate carbon emissions. And now Congress is taking up the issue in earnest. Tenaska's objective has been to find ways to develop the baseload resources required for the electricity market, but we weren't willing to invest in solid fuel projects without addressing the climate change issue. So a question before us was how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the design of projects today. To that end, we needed to assure ourselves that carbon capture technologies were ready for a utility-scale project, a secure home was available for captured carbon dioxide, and the economics and long-term financing arrangements for such projects could work. On February 19, 2008, Tenaska announced the Trailblazer Energy Center, a 760 megawatt gross and 600 megawatt net output supercritical pulverized coal electric generation facility with the capability to capture 85 to 90% of its carbon dioxide. The site is near pipelines to the world's largest market for carbon dioxide, Permian Basin enhanced oil recovery. 2 railroads serve the site, and the electrical interconnection is also nearby. The comment period on Trailblazer's draft air permit closed on April 17th, and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality will be working toward a final permit over the next months. We've received competitive proposals for the facility's design and construction, are working on detailed engineering studies to support the financial closing, and a construction start in 2010. Commercial operation could be as early as 2015. Through our work with leading EPC contractors and equipment manufacturers, Tenaska is increasingly confident that we can finance the project and negotiate suitable terms for the plant's construction. Local and state governments have provided tax incentives for building the plant and are encouraging oil producers to use the facility as CO2. We still need some form of federal incentive participation to make the project work, but that seems increasingly likely. Trailblazer's significance is that it will demonstrate post-combustion capture technology for existing power plants that today contribute 2 billion tons to the U.S. emission inventory and 10 billion tons to the worldwide emission inventory. By locating near a viable CO2 market, Trailblazer can pioneer this technology at a reduced cost. The Taylorville Energy Center is a hybrid integrated gasification combined cycle electric generation facility being developed by Christian County Generation, with Tenaska as the managing partner. The project will manufacture pipeline quality substitute natural gas, or methane, from Illinois bituminous coal. SNG will fuel the power block. The amount of SNG produced will significantly exceed our requirements, annually freeing up 10 billion cubic feet of SNG for eventual sale off-site. The facility will employ 1,500 construction workers and create hundreds of permanent jobs in the coal and power sectors. Taylorville will capture 50 to 60% of the carbon dioxide that would otherwise have been emitted, remove moisture and sulfur compounds, and compress the carbon dioxide stream for pipeline transport, either to nearby geologic sequestration wells or for use in EOR operations elsewhere. The power island will have criteria pollutant emissions equal to those of a combined cycle natural gas generation facility. No electric generation facility utilizing coal-derived fuel operating anywhere approaches the proposed emission performance of Taylorville.
If you could try to summarize, sir.
Yet the project relies exclusively on proven technologies for coal gasification, gas processing, and power generation. The one important thing for all these types of projects, and we think they're real projects that can come off in the near future and begin construction as early as next year, is providing some sort of regulatory framework and certainty for these projects. We've provided specific comments on aspects of the ACES draft in our testimony, and we look to those provisions. But there's a whole variety of ways that the bill could support these types of projects.
Thank you, Dr. And how much CO2 can you take out of the coal?
The Trailblazer project in Texas would take 90%.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Mr. Hawkins, Mr. David Hawkins, the director of the Climate Center at the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of the most frequent visitors to this committee in its history. He has been working on air pollution issues for over 30 years. We welcome you back. Whenever you are comfortable, please begin.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm going to focus today on a pathway for coal. NRDC, as an environmental organization, is a strong supporter of efficiency and renewable energy resources, but we also believe that it is important to have a pathway for advanced coal. It's important in order to get the policy support for the protection of the climate programs that we need, and it's important to actually make those climate protection programs happen more easily in the real world. We think we can get deep cuts in carbon dioxide emissions faster and at lower costs if coal with carbon capture is on the table as part of the toolbox, and that's why we very strongly support it. NRDC is a member of the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, and we put forward in that document what we believed was an integrated package of policy support for carbon capture and disposal. There were 4 things that we recommended. The first was a requirement for the government to get its act together in terms of developing the necessary permitting rules. The second was a program to do early government financial support so that we could get 5 gigawatts of coal capacity with carbon capture deployed by 2015. Sounds like Tenaska could be part of that 5 gigawatts. The third element would be a transitional program where the early movers in the carbon capture world would get a financial incentive. This is very important to overcome the competitive barriers to these kinds of technologies, even in the early years of a cap-and-trade program. And the fourth thing we recommended was a set of mandatory emission standards for new coal plants so that we would have clarity and an assurance that we didn't have to rely just on market forces, but we'd have that good old-fashioned regulation that says here's a performance standard, you need to meet it. And by the way, there'll be financial incentives to help you do even better. The ACES discussion draft does a great job of embracing these concepts and articulating them, and while there are a few places where some added detail would be helpful, we think that it is a very great job, and we're very supportive of it. In our view, carbon capture and disposal is a real option. It can be made into a reality out in the world if it has adequate policy support. That policy support has been lacking, but it can be provided through the kind of provisions that are in the ACES draft, and for that reason we support it. Mr. Chairman, we've heard lots of concerns over the last couple of days about whether the technology is available or whether it is available at a reasonable cost. And there have been lots of concerns and legitimately expressed concerns about the fact that this may cost too much, that we simply can't afford to do what's being proposed in this legislation. Well, 73 years ago, the predecessor of this committee heard from then Chairman Sam Rayburn about the need to have a major energy advance. It was called the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. And some of the same arguments that we've heard mounted today about the need to protect the climate and whether we could afford to do it were put forward then. It was said that the technology did not exist to bring electricity to rural Americans. It was said that if it did exist, it would be simply too expensive and ruinous. Well, 73 years ago, this committee acted, and it passed out by one vote, the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. And the result was an economy that the world still cannot beat. This is the world's greatest economy, and it's brought to that level in large part by electrification. It was that kind of technological advance and willingness to say, you know, we think these challenges can be met. Today, the challenge is even greater, and the stakes are higher, and the rewards are greater. But it's going to come down to the same thing, the men and women of this committee voting to do what we need to do to create the future that we need to create. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. And it comes in full circle, doesn't it? 73 years ago, we were voting to bring electricity to rural America. Now we're going to be voting on bringing electricity from rural America, the sun and the wind, and biomass to urban America. And we might only win by one vote. Okay? But that will be the perfect circle then when it's completed. Perfect. Our next witness is Eugene Trisco on behalf of the United Mine Workers of America. Mr. Trisco has represented the United Mine Workers for more than 20 years. He is a member of the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Air Act Advisory Committee and has appeared before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia concerning the Clean Air Act. Welcome, sir. If you could move in a little bit closer and turn on your microphone. I'm not sure that the microphone is on yet.
There you go. We have it.
Okay,
I'm pleased to be here today to testify on behalf of the United Mine Workers. The UMWA has sought technological solutions to the environmental challenges facing coal for decades. The UMWA recognizes that climate change legislation poses potentially the greatest threat to its membership and to the continued use of coal. In July 2007, the mine workers and other industrial unions endorsed the bipartisan Bingham-Inspector Climate Change Bill. Achieving the proper balance among technology incentives and the timing and stringency of emission reductions will be essential for obtaining bipartisan support for climate legislation. 1/2 of our electricity today is generated by coal. 23 states rely on coal for more than half of their electric supplies. To reduce coal in our energy mix means using another fuel to replace it for baseload generation, most likely a combination of natural gas and nuclear. There's a great deal in this proposed legislation that UMWA supports. We strongly endorse Section 114, incorporating the Carbon Capture and Storage Early Deployment Act, reintroduced this year by Representative Boucher and a bipartisan group of co-sponsors. The programs called for by this section will provide critical non-budget support for the early demonstration of CCS technologies on a commercial scale. CCS technology is the principal means for assuring that coal can continue to supply a significant share of our electric generating needs. These technologies also can provide a major source of new, well-paying, low-carbon jobs. Our statement summarizes a recent study showing that deployment of 65 to 100 gigawatts of new advanced coal capacity with CCS could create 5 to 7 million job years of employment during construction and more than 250,000 permanent jobs. The UMWA supports the objectives of the CCS incentives provided in Section 115. The mine workers recommend that the committee develop an allowance-based mechanism for funding qualifying CCS facilities. Such incentives will be critical to attracting capital investment in new and retrofit applications. The timing and availability of Section 115 support should provide planning certainty. We regard the period from 2020 to 2040 as critical for avoiding the large-scale loss of coal markets. As to scale, we recommend a range of 65 to 100 gigawatts of new and retrofit capacity based on U.S. EPA's analysis of previous climate bills. The mine workers recommend that the bill avoid specifying CO2 performance standards limited to coal-based generating units. NSPS are unnecessary for these sources since all cap sources will be required to comply with the bill's declining cap. To avoid the risk of WTO challenges, we suggest that the bill's international border adjustment provisions be modified consistent with IBEW and AEP's suggested changes submitted to the committee on April 17th. The UMWA favors the largest possible use of allowance allocations to the electric distribution and independent generation sectors and to vulnerable manufacturing industries. We support the recommended approach to allocations outlined in the recent letter to Chairman Waxman by the IBEW and the utility workers. The UMWA is mainly concerned about the 20% reduction target for the year 2020. This target is well above the 6% target proposed by the Dingell-Boucher December 2008 discussion draft and President Obama's proposed 14% target. Commercial use of CCS by 2020 is likely to be limited to a handful of early mover plants. Recent modeling of similar emission control proposals shows that 1/3 to 1/2 of coal-based generating capacity could be retired between 2015 and 2030. EPA's preliminary modeling of the bill shows this occurring by 2040, even with aggressive CCS assumptions. Such impacts must be avoided if the nation is to retain domestic coal as a principal energy supply. The UMWA thus urges moderation in the choice of the 2020 target, recognizing that the majority of the emission reductions required by the bill occur later in the program when technological advances should facilitate the continued use of coal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Driscoll. Our next witness, Jonathan Briggs, who is Regional Director of Americans for Hydrogen Energy. Mr. Briggs is responsible for managing Hydrogen Energy's project in California and developing other hydrogen energy business opportunities in North America. Thank you, Mr. Briggs.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. HEI, or Hydrogen Energy International, offers commercial-scale deployment of low-carbon hydrogen fuel power plants with carbon capture and storage. It offers the ability to bring together the complementary skills of its two parent companies, BP and Rio Tinto. Hydrogen Energy, HEI, is currently developing two projects, one in Abu Dhabi, the other in California. Our project in California is located in Kern County and will distribute 250 megawatts of much-needed baseload low-carbon power. The project's primary feedstock is petroleum coke, a refinery byproduct along with coal as needed, and will capture and store 90% of its CO2 emissions in the Elk Hill oil field for sequestration and enhanced oil recovery. The project has been designed and developed to provide numerous environmental and economic benefits for the state. It will conserve freshwater resources by using brackish groundwater with zero liquid discharge. It will create 1,500 construction jobs and 100 permanent jobs in an economically depressed region of the state. And the project will also significantly boost state and local tax revenue from EOR. Just 2 months ago, the PUC voted 5-0 to a direct $30 million of support to our project. This is unprecedented and a demonstration of political leadership that first-mover projects such as ours need. And while I have the opportunity, I would like to thank the CPUC, including Commissioner Grunish, for recognizing the need for in-state, low-carbon baseload power. We filed for the planning permit and the site license and will be up and running by 2015, contingent on the development of appropriate policy support framework. In order to meet the aggressive emission reduction goals that are outlined in the draft ACES bill, CCS must be widely deployed and quickly to drive down the costs of future plants. Just as pre-combustion capture technology is proven, so is the storage of CO2. In the US, there are more than 3,500 miles of CO2 pipelines to support enhanced oil recovery, an activity which has been conducted safely and without incident for the last 30 years. We believe that storing CO2 in existing oil and gas fields in connection with the EOR will significantly advance the near-term deployment of CCS by bringing down the costs of early mover projects such as ours. Like other forms of clean energy, CCS is more expensive than conventional energy. The majority of the extra capital cost lies with the power plant rather than the sequestration activity. The cost of CCS today is more than $100 of CO2 per ton of CO2. That may seem like a lot, but remember, this technology is still in the early development stages, and despite other technologies having enjoyed years of learning, low-carbon hydrogen power with CCS is competitive with nuclear and renewable energies. So cost, while important, is not a reason to forego or stall the rollout of this technology. The draft ACES bill is a welcome first step to identifying CCS as a needed technology to mitigate GHG emissions. HEI appreciates the support shown for CCS in the Waxman-Markey draft, particularly fixed incentive payments where critical to project sanction, feedstock neutrality, and recognition of geologic sequestration combined with enhanced hydrocarbon recovery. In addition, we hope that any climate change bill would also recognize the need for early movers, provide clear and definitive performance qualification terms, and tie fiscal support to the levels of CO2 capture, such as the 90% that I referred to earlier. Before I close, I would like to leave the committee with one other recommendation regarding the regulatory certainty needed to allow CCS to move forward. We need one regulator, one set of regulations, and acknowledgement that EOR and sequestration can act simultaneously. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to testify before you today and remind you that CCS is ready today. We just need fixed, near, and medium-term incentives to get these projects off the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Briggs. You had 10 seconds left. I'm just dying to know, is your sequestration through pumping into oil fields? Is that the sequestration system you're using? Thank you very much. That was most interesting. Our next witness is Mr. James Kerr, who is partner with McGuire Woods, LLP. He's previously served as commissioner on the North Carolina Utilities Commission and as president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners from 07 to 08. Today, he's appearing on behalf of the Electric Reliability Coordinating Council. Thanks, Mr. Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My perspective today is that of a former utility regulator, and where I examined regulatory policy to be sure that it was both cost-effective and equitable among and between customer classes and across regions. My testimony focuses on the RES and the CCS portions of the bill that's before the subcommittee. Let me first focus in these remarks on what I believe to be certain inequities concern and cost-effectiveness concerns with the RES. I'm concerned that the bill as drafted will be both cost ineffective and inequitable for ratepayers in the Southeast and Midwest where cost-effective renewable resources are limited. First, the first concern is that the RES conflicts with a market-based cap-and-trade program. Renewables are simply one option to decarbonize power fleets and reduce carbon. They may or may not be the most cost-effective option for doing that. However, and the price signal sent by the cap is supposed to decide this issue. Since the RES is a performance-based standard that must be complied with regardless of cost, it undermines the cap's basic least cost approach. In effect, the RES is a bet that renewables and not some other alternative will be the most cost-effective solution for carbon reductions under the cap, all the way up to the full amount of the RES. Most troubling to me is that there appear to be no economic studies supporting the fact that a 25% RES by 2025 will provide the most cost-effective carbon reduction, more cost-effective carbon reductions than the cap program itself. Hence, I refer to the RES as a bet. Second, the RES gives ratepayers in resource-poor states 3 compliance options, each of which is uneconomic to them and provides little benefit. My second concern is that ratepayers in resource-poor states will be assessed significant costs to comply with the RES for which they will receive no benefit. Instead, the monies will flow to the benefit of the ratepayers in resource-rich states and either subsidize those ratepayers' RES compliance costs or those ratepayers' fleet decarbonization efforts and associated carbon cap costs. To illustrate this, I thought I would use an example where I'm a utility owner or a regulator, or for that matter, simply a citizen in a resource-poor state where renewables tend to cost more than in resource-rich states. I would have three choices available to me under this legislative proposal. First, I can build above market. By that I mean higher cost renewable power than the prevailing REC price renewables facilities in my state. That will ensure that green jobs and investment capital provided by ratepayers remains in state, and that will provide some benefits towards carbon compliance in state. But the cost for compliance with the RES will be higher than if other alternatives are adopted. However, since I also get a carbon benefit if I build my own renewables facilities, I need to subtract that cost savings from my renewables costs, and those economics will likely make me build some and perhaps many above-market renewable facilities. That result makes sense to me and my ratepayers because it is the lowest cost solution to the dual compliance obligations of the carbon cap and the RES. But it makes no sense as national policy. The result will be nationally more above-market renewable facilities in the Southeast and Midwest and fewer economic renewables facilities in resource-rich states. And of course, since renewables will be part of the compliance with the carbon cap and the overall cost of renewables is higher than it need to be because above-market facilities are built, the cost of compliance with that cap nationally will be higher than they would be without the RES. My second choice is to purchase RECs to fund construction of renewable facilities in another state with better renewable resources. If I do that, my ratepayers' compliance costs with the RES will be lower, but I will have to go back to them for more money to fund investments in carbon reductions for my system, since I have received no carbon benefit from the renewable power facility funded by my ratepayers' REC dollars. In addition, I will have funded the creation of green jobs in the resource-rich state, but not my own, and I will have funded fleet decarbonization efforts in the resource-rich state through construction of a renewable facility, but not my own. As a consequence, I have subsidized the carbon compliance cost of the ratepayers in the resource-rich state, who will not see rate increases to fund the carbon reductions my renewable power facility has made for them. My third choice is to make an alternative compliance payment. This option would also allow my ratepayers to comply with the RES at a lower cost, but again, they see no carbon reduction benefits for the payments, and I will have to go back to them for additional monies to fund my own carbon reduction efforts. In addition, the monies I spend making alternative compliance payments are returned to the resource-rich states that complied with the RES and presumably refunded to those ratepayers. Thus, my alternative compliance payments subsidize RES compliance costs of citizens in resource-rich states, but my ratepayers see no benefits. As a former public servant and citizen, I do not like any of these choices. None make any economic sense to my ratepayers, and they do nothing to address climate change, since the cap already requires carbon reductions independent of the RES. Frankly, I'm baffled as to why I would have to make a choice between three such poor options. No one has told me that renewables up to the full amount of the RES are the most cost-effective way to reduce carbon. And no one has told me that the U.S. renewables industry cannot sustain itself based on the price signal the cap will send, the existing plethora of 33 state RES requirements, and other financial incentives available to renewables. It seems to me that the primary effect of the RES requirement is to pick winners and losers, and that the ratepayers in resource-rich states will be the clear winners, while ratepayers in resource-poor states will be the clear losers. I want to be clear, I'm not against renewables in any way. They are an important part of the toolkit to address climate change, and they will be employed at scale under any carbon cap up to the point that they are the most cost-effective alternative. What I am against is the imposition of a very large federal renewables mandate that effectively advantages ratepayers in resource-rich states and disadvantages ratepayers in resource-poor states for no compelling reason. While I do not see the need for any mandatory federal RES, my written testimony does have some suggestions that will limit but not eliminate these inequities. Finally, with respect to CCS, the ERCC supports the efforts in the bill to generate research, development, and deployment of CCS. We also, however, provide a couple of comments that might help shape that piece of the legislation. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. Our next witness is Dr. Jay, is it Apt, sir? Dr. Jay Apt, who's Executive Director of the Carnegie Mellon Electricity Industry Center and an Associate Professor at Carnegie Mellon University. We hope Dr. Apt feels very much at home today because he has been in space, flying 4 times and logging more than 35 days in that environment and over 10 hours in spacewalks. We hope this is an easy experience. Dr. Apt, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like to tell people that I'm probably the only person in the room who owes their life to solar cells. Appreciate not only the invitation, but your stamina. As you said, at Carnegie Mellon, I'm a faculty member in both the engineering school and the business college. I've studied the electric power industry for many years at our Carnegie Mellon Electricity Industry Center. Look, burning any appreciable fraction of the estimated fossil fuel resources on this planet without carbon dioxide control is going to send CO2 levels to places that humans have never experienced and cause really dangerous climate change. There's no question that the singular focus, our goal, ought to be controlling CO2. Renewable energy sources are going to be an important part of whatever we do in this country. But I caution that a singular emphasis on renewable energy is not the best way to meet that overriding goal of controlling CO2. We spend about 3% of GDP annually on electricity. Removing 80% of the CO2 from electric power with the most cost-effective technologies will take about 2/3 of a percent of GDP. That turns out to be just about what we spent on the Clean Air Act. That's affordable. But if we try to specify which technologies, like renewables, are the only ones that need apply, and don't allow the least expensive technologies to compete, costs can grow to unaffordable levels. It's important to develop competing low-carbon technologies to keep costs low, rather than trying to select technologies based on attributes that have little to do with controlling CO2. A national RES is a costly way to reduce CO2 emissions because renewable and low greenhouse gas are not synonyms. There's several other practical and often less expensive ways, and you heard about some of them just now, to reduce CO2 from electric power generation. As you know, renewable energy is concentrated only in certain states. The Southeast doesn't have either good wind or good solar. It does have biomass, but that's going to be needed for production of liquid fuels. Legislation should give each region the greatest flexibility to reduce CO2 at the least cost, including renewables, efficiency, conservation, fossil fuels with CCS, and nuclear. Mandating technologies can be much more expensive than mandating performance. Renewable performance standards unnecessarily increase costs in an attempt to eliminate the use of uranium, coal, natural gas, and large hydropower. What's needed instead is a carbon performance standard that lowers the limits in a predictable fashion on the emission of CO2 for every kilowatt hour produced. To affordably lower CO2, we're going to need everything that works. No power source is free of problems. Our research has examined what was then the largest solar array in the country in the desert in Arizona. It had a duty cycle, what we call the capacity factor, of 19%, averaged over 2 years. All the wind farms in Texas last year added together had a capacity factor of 29%. That means that 70% of the time, you've got to use something else. And our research shows that natural gas turbines used to provide fill-in power as the wind rises and falls or clouds cover the sun produce more CO2 and much more NOx, nitrous oxide, than they do when running steadily. That lessens the beneficial effects of wind or solar. One solution is to store large amounts of electricity when these sources are generating. The discussion draft doesn't appear to me to contain significant incentives for large-scale storage, and I think it ought to. If our industries are to be able to afford electricity, it's essential that demonstration coal plants with carbon capture be built to improve the technology and show that we can sequester CO2 without leakage in a range of geology. The Section 114 incentives seem to me to be at the low end of what's required to demonstrate the commercial viability of sequestration. It's also essential that we build half a dozen nuclear plants using new technology to assess their costs and performance, or we're going to be importing that technology from abroad. I hope that you'll keep two principles in mind. First, focus on reducing carbon dioxide rather than singling out renewables as the answer. There's significant savings from letting all the technologies compete in satisfying the goals of lowering greenhouse gas emissions and increasing energy security, while ensuring that energy prices aren't so high that they derail our economy. Second, ensure that efficiency gains in generating electricity, as well as in using it, can count in any low-carbon legislative mandate, such as Section 231 of the discussion draft. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. Along with my written testimony, I provided the subcommittee with one of our published papers. I think the research outlined in the paper might be of interest and value, and would ask that that be included as part of the hearing record.
So no objection, Dr. Abt. Thank you very much.